Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to this final installment of the lecture series about Babylonia under Persian rule. I show you for the last time the program we are following, or we have been following, in the series of talks I have been giving here. So I talked about the sources, about the protagonists of Babylonian history in the 6th, 5th, and 4th century. And the final point I want to address now is summarized on the slide as interactions, continuities, and ruptures. The main historical event I will talk about in the course of this lecture is the rebellion against Xerxes in 484 BC. This is in part owed to the bias of the sources, which are comparatively numerous and informative regarding this event. It is also owed to the fact that arguably this event constituted an important rupture in the history of Babylonia under Persian rule. I will only touch upon the issue of the accession to power of Darius, and in particular the case of Uruk, that is the changes that occurred in the city of Uruk right after the consolidation of Darius's power. This would be an interesting topic that could be discussed from different angles, but for reasons of time I will only address it as a case of comparison that may throw some light on the events regarding Xerxes and the rebellions against his rule that occurred in the second year of his reign. Now, 484 BC, that is the second year of Xerxes. We by now are fairly certain about the date of these rebellions that originated in the pretensions of two Babylonian usurper kings, a certain Shamash-sheriba and a certain Bel-shimani, about whom we do not know very much. These two men controlled parts of northern Babylonia subsequently, or in part also at the same time. The chronology has been discussed and has mostly been resolved. I will be concerned here more with the consequences of these rebellions and also with the motifs that brought a significant part of Babylonia to rebel against Persian rule. Now, the consequences. Several readings of the evidence have been offered in the past. These general lines of interpretation are summarized on the slide you see here. The interpretation that one might call the traditional view assumes that there was a widespread disruption of economic and social life, and especially that the Persian reprisals after the squashing of the rebels comprised also fairly widespread destruction of temples and thereby fundamental disruption of the core area of Babylonian social and religious life. This traditional view, as I call it, is in part based on Greek sources, on evidence that can be culled from Herodotus or from Ctesias. This traditional view was challenged, as far as I know, systematically for the first time in the 1980s. The view that I perhaps not very happily call here the innovative classicists view, or could also call it a revisionist view or some such thing, sees the rebellions and especially the consequences of the rebellions as a phenomenon of more or less limited impact. The Greek sources are discredited to a large degree as literary productions, as Greek projections that reflect Greek concerns. They are problematic and should not be used for a linear reconstruction of Babylonian history. Amélie Court and Sherwin White are two scholars who are usually associated with the promulgation of this position. Then we have a third position that has come to the fore in the last 6-7 years. It has been voiced already before this time, but two articles appeared in 2004 that can be considered crucial for this viewpoint. The position that is shared by several Assyriologists working on this late evidence is that 484 does constitute an important watershed in the socio-economic development of Babylonia, even though the exact nature of the change that occurred at the time is still a matter of debate. The two colleagues who were instrumental in reviving the debate and in stating the case for what I call here, perhaps again in not entirely happy fashion, the Assyriologist view. These two colleagues are Karl-Heinz Kessler and Caroline Waseches. So what is the actual evidence? And I will talk here again conforming to the general principles I adopted for this lecture series. I will talk about Babylonian evidence exclusively. What is the evidence? First, we have the phenomenon of end of archives. This is a kind of sobriquet which refers to the fact that several temple archives, including the huge archive of the Sippar temple of Ebabar, and several important private archives, in fact a large number of private archives from northern Babylonia, come to an end in the second year of Xerxes. There are simply no texts from these archives which post-date the second year. If one looks at the distribution of these archives, and this is the original contribution of Caroline Waseches in this respect, if one looks at the composition of these archives, one sees a clear pattern. Archives of priests are affected, and archives of Babylonian businessmen, of entrepreneurs who have close contacts to the Babylonian provincial institutions. The one archive that can be associated with a family that actually has a leading role in one of these provincial institutions, this archive comes to an end too. On the other hand, one sees that smaller archives that are associated with men, rarely with entire families, who depend to some extent on royal patronage and who do business with the royal administration, do not come to an end. They continue. And from these texts, one wouldn't have thought that the second year of Xerxes constitutes an important break. The evidence in the south is generally more consistent and does not display the rupture of the second year of Xerxes, or I should amend this to some extent. It does reflect this rupture in an indirect fashion, about which I will talk in a couple of minutes. If one analyzes the structure of the archives that come to an end in the second year of Xerxes, one sees again a clear pattern. These are archives that have been deposited in an orderly fashion. So these are not living archives, as the technical terminology would be, that are cut off by a traumatic climatic event such as destruction or I don't know, invasion of hordes of Persians or some such thing. These are archives that have been sifted and from which crucial files, usually in the context of private documentation, have been property texts have been removed. So the private archives are collections of texts that have been deprived of those documents that are that were of crucial importance for the last generation of the archive holders. The temple archives, and especially the Babur archive, we're talking here about an archive of, well, in total, perhaps 20,000 cuneiform tablets. The temple archives display the same evidence of sifting. If one analyzes the text types represented in the Babur archive during the last years of the run of the archive, so from, say, the 30th year of Darius onwards down to the second year of Xerxes, one sees a gradual narrowing of the scope of the archives. Several text types are missing, and the bulk of the material is made up by completely ephemeral records that would have lost their importance for a temple administration very soon after their having been drafted. So this is basically, I don't want to say rubbish, but it is in any case documentation that was of no immediate importance for a temple administration, and which for that reason apparently was deposited. Important files, property documents, loan contracts and so forth that had a bearing on, that were still sort of active and had economic importance, were apparently removed. So we have evidence for careful selection and for a careful revision of the documentation, which means, if nothing else, that whoever deposited these files knew that something was coming, and these people were aware of the need to go through the documentation, and they had the time to do so. In the case of the Babur archive, the time necessary for the sifting of the archives must have been considerable. Now, the end of archives is essentially a phenomenon that has to do with an argumentum e silentio. When we move to Uruk, we have concrete evidence, not just evidence of absence. And this, I think, gives special importance to the argument made by Kessler in an article published in 2004, in the same year in which Vasich's article appeared. Kessler's article has perhaps not been read as careful as it should have been, which possibly may have to do with the language. In any case, Kessler proves that in Uruk, in the temple administration, and generally in the realm of the priesthood in Uruk, those families that originated in Babylon were removed, or well, basically they disappeared, and the prominent positions they held within the temple administration were no longer under their control. So a whole range of important families that to a large extent dominate socio-economic life in Uruk simply disappears. The Erna temple is closed down, and the famous shift of the local Urukian cult to the veneration of the old Sumerian god Anu takes place. The Anu temple becomes the new center of the local cult. The beneficiaries of this change of cultic organization are the Urukian families, so the families of Urukian origin rather than origin in Babylon, who previously held important positions in Erna next to the Babylonian families who have disappeared. This shift, which for the local concerns of Urukian people must have been momentous, can be dated on the basis of positive evidence to well, it can be limited down to a range of how many years? 13 years. The Terminus Postquem is a document from the 29th year of Darius, and the Terminus Antequem is the 6th year of Xerxes. So in this period of 13 years, we have positive evidence that the whole system of the cult and of the social organization in Uruk was changed drastically. Other evidence. We see in the documentation post-dating the year 484 that comes from the north that family names largely disappear from the record. Family names are the third part of Babylonian names, names that refer to clans with whom the name bearer wants to be associated. If you remember my brief remarks on the structure of the Babylonian society in this period, you will remember this term of house society that was coined by Claude Lévi-Strauss that can be used to serve as a label for this type of society. Clans or lineages were decisive for the self-image of these people, especially of the upper classes of society. Their identity was largely based on their affiliation with such kin groups or families, as we call them, perhaps in a slightly misleading fashion. The names that refer to these families largely disappear from the record, as I said, which must reflect important social change, the ramifications of which, however, are open to discussion. Furthermore, we see that previously unknown, unheard of families or lineages hold what offices in Babylon and Borsippa are documented after 484 BC. This is especially, I've talked about this briefly, this is especially clear in Borsippa, where we have very rich evidence for the small number of families who controlled the office of city governor and of chief priest in the city in the 6th century. These families disappear in the 5th century, so after 484 we have no more evidence for them. And another family that is never mentioned before in the Borsippa documentation suddenly appears and holds the office of city governor. Some offices disappear entirely. In part, these offices seem to have disappeared. At least we have no evidence for these offices from 484 onwards. For others, we have one or two attestations from the later reign of Xerxes, but none whatsoever from Artaxerxes onwards. So I mention this because we have to be aware of the fact that the textual evidence from the reign of Xerxes overall is rather thin, and there is always the temptation to telescope together evidence of absence and link it to 484, even though it is possible that some of these changes that we see in the course of the 5th century occurred, in fact, after the event of 484. And finally, the last point, and also potentially the most informative, but on the other hand also the most problematic at this point, in the sort of development of research bearing on 484, the most important point would be archaeological evidence, of course. Do we have archaeological evidence that can be linked in any way to the disruptions of 484 BC? The most promising site one has to turn to in this respect is, of course, Babylon. The city of Babylon that has been excavated by the German excavation led by Koldewey in the early 20th century. If one reads the excavation reports, which are unfortunately to a large extent preliminary reports and explicitly state this fact in their introductions, which sometimes is not taken into account by later interpreters of these reports. If one reads these preliminary reports, one sees that some of the excavators, notably Reuter, who discussed the Merkes area, the central domestic area that was extensively excavated, do see some evidence of destruction that they want to connect with the reprisals of Xerxes after the rebellions. However, it has been argued by the what I call here the Innsbruck school of interpretation of the Babylonian of the evidence from Babylon, that this reading of the archaeological evidence is largely based on an a priori understanding of the historical sequence of the historical events in this period that is in its turn based on Greek historiography. So Rollinger and his colleagues argue that the excavators sort of excavated with Herodotus and Ctesias and so forth in hand, and basically wanted to find evidence for the Greek narrative they found in their sources. According to these Innsbruck colleagues, the evidence for archaeologically visible destruction that can be linked to 484 does not stand up to a critical scrutiny. However, also the work done by Rollinger, by Heinz, by Kuntner in this respect is preliminary, since much of the evidence remains still unpublished, and one will have to wait presumably for a large-scale Babylon project that will have to be launched by colleagues in Berlin to hear the, well, perhaps not the final word on this issue, but at least to see significant progress. I will return to this issue slightly later. Now, other change in the 5th century that chronologically occurs over a longer period and that cannot be directly related to the events around Xerxes' accession and these rebellions, but which nevertheless may reflect social change that potentially was kicked off in the aftermath of the rebellions, perhaps. Change in the 5th century in this respect concerns document formats. I have talked about this briefly. Document formats, both the legal formulae and the format of the physical tablets, change comparatively rapidly in the 5th and 4th century. This change is even clearer to someone who also takes into account 6th and 7th century documentation. The document formats and the legal formulae in the 6th and 7th century are comparatively stable and do not evolve very much. And this makes the comparatively rapid change in the later 5th and in the 4th century even more evident. We have some evidence for the evolving of legal institutions and terminology. I have been talking about this earlier. We see evidence for a much stronger presence of Persians, of Persian officials, also of Persian loanwords and so forth in the evidence. So the fact that Babylonia is under Persian rule is much clearer in the 5th century documentation than in the late 6th century. I have also mentioned the fact that we have many more non-Babylonians in the administration, especially the presence of Egyptians is striking. We also have, but this is a matter of further research, we also have evidence for linguistic change that seems to be more rapid and more incisive than whatever we can find in the 6th century, but discussing these matters would lead us too far. We see, I think, significant change in the socio-economic structure, especially of the wealthy classes, if you wish. I summarize this evidence by claiming that we see other economic agents. This may be slightly too general. I will explain what I mean. In the evidence, we see that landed wealth clearly predominates. So the main interest of rich archive holders, to phrase it as in as general terms as I can find, the main interest of rich archives holders lies in the accumulation of land and in the exploitation of land. we do not find evidence, or very little evidence, for such people engaged in commercial ventures of some sort, in tax farming, in entrepreneurial activities that are very, very much in evidence also for landholding families in the 6th century. A clear example, for instance, is the Borsippa archive, where the priests disappear, but the very rich land-owning Tatano family remains. The Tatano family is a family that is in evidence already during the reign of Darius. They seem to have links to the royal administration, even though for the period of the reign of Darius these links are reflected only indirectly in the sources. After 484, the links to the royal administration become clearer in the evidence. The Tatanos are extremely rich. They are far richer than any of the priestly families we hear of in Borsippa in the 6th century. They clearly belong to a different stratum of society that was not affected by the events of 484 BC. We see accumulation of wealth in the hands of Persian aristocrats, of members of the royal family, of course, of royal officials, and of people like the Tatanos, so of people whom one might call Babylonian protégés of the Persian administration. And as I said, we do not know what happened to the Babylonian urban entrepreneurs, so to the group of class, perhaps, of people who are well documented in the 6th century with their interest, on the one hand, in agricultural business, and on the other hand, in commercial ventures, in tax farming, and other types of business of this kind. So we have very little evidence for such people after 484 BC. The Murashus, I should say, are a case apart. Now, what do we make of this evidence? There is consensus that after the rebellion, the traditional northern Babylonian elites were no longer in their position of privilege. That much is out of discussion. The question, however, the questions that can be posed concern, on the one hand, the roots of the rebellion, and on the other hand, of course, they concern the context of the change that we see reflected in the sources with such clarity. The first question then is the roots of the rebellion. One hypothesis has been brought to the fore recently a couple of times by colleagues who are indirectly, at least, linked to the Innsbruck School of Interpretation, as I have called it. Rollinger has posed the question whether the changes we see after 484 may not in fact be the results of administrative reform to some extent that was brought into effect by Xerxes before the rebellions, thereby kicking off the rebellion. So Rollinger poses the question whether these Babylonian elites weren't removed from their positions through concerted action of the Persian administration, which prompted them to rebel. The answer to this question, I'm afraid, is simply no. I think we can exclude this possibility if we look at the evidence, especially in the Borsippa archives, that are the richest source of information. We see that up to the very final point in time, when the rebellions are of Shamash-e-Riba and Bel-Shemani are actually ongoing, there is no fundamental administrative change in the system. So administrative change as such is not directly reflected in these Borsippian sources. They just finish at a certain point. So the assumption that the Persians interfered with the administration in such a significant way before the rebellions is, I think, rather unlikely. Another question that has been posed is the question whether or not an economic crisis may have prompted Babylonians to rebel. We have some evidence that can be brought to bear on this issue that dates from the 6th century, and this is the very rich evidence of Babylonian price data. I show you, I will do this very quickly, the development of prices in the 6th century. So the period we are interested in here is from 540 to 485 or so, which is when the evidence ends. This is the period of Persian domination. Here the barley prices, this is a pattern we will see again and again, fairly stable or falling prices for the first half of the century, rising prices in the last years of Babylonian rule, and then steeply rising prices, especially from 520 onwards. So this is barley, this is sesame. This is date prices, slightly different from barley, even though dates are the second main crop of Babylonia, but we don't have to discuss the reasons for the difference between the barley and the date prices. Wool prices, same pattern, even though we have not very much evidence for the Persian period here, so this part of the curve has to be taken with a grain of salt. Sheep prices, again the same pattern, even though the curve is slightly flatter. Slave prices can be taken as proxy data for the cost of labor, and also here we see a development which is similar to what we've seen for barley. And this is the evidence I have for wages. There is not enough wage data to plot the development, but you see in this catograph, these yellow dots are evidence for wages, that also wages go up in the Persian period. So the cost for labor increased significantly. This is the price development in the 6th century, telescoped together by taking the value for 560 as index 100. So you see that the barley price, for instance, rose sixfold between 560 and 510, which is, of course, a significant change. The general price level rose not quite as dramatically as in the case of barley, but still a tripling or quadrupling of the prices in those 50 years was the rule. How do we interpret this evidence? I cannot give you all the arguments that lie behind the summary here. I will just summarize briefly. The general price rise that we see even in the last decade or so of Babylonian rule is in part owed to inflation. So there's simply more silver in circulation, and this causes prices to rise by itself. This is not necessarily evidence of a crisis. Under Cambyses, and perhaps also for the first years of Darius, even though the evidence is slim, we have cases of supply shocks, so basically bad harvests. The 4th year of Cambyses, for instance, was a particularly problematic year, and such years may have occurred later too. And as we know, of course, a bad barley harvest will cause also other prices to rise quite substantially. We do not have evidence for a significant withdrawal of silver from circulation under Darius. I emphasize this because it has been suggested in the past that Persian taxation caused a withdrawal of silver from circulation in Babylonia. This is in part an interpretation of Persian taxation that is owed to Herodotus. We don't have this evidence, basically, and I think the development of the prices actually contradicts this reading of the data, since we wouldn't have these rising prices if silver would become ever scarcer. So there is certainly no deflation. And finally, last point, the evidence would be consistent with the hypothesis that we see what economists call a demand shock under Darius, that is significant withdrawal of staples and of labor from the Babylonian market. Again, the assumption that lie behind my use of demand shock, supply shock, market, and so forth, that perhaps for some of you may be surprising, would take us too far. I just summarize here what I still consider a hypothesis. The years in which we see the most significant price rise, so basically 520 to 495, or perhaps 515 to 495. This is the period in which Babylonian society, Babylonian institutions were required to supply significant amounts of staples, apparently, and generally resources, especially also resources of labor, for the Persian administration, resources that were used for work in Elam, especially in the capital of Susa. So if one wanted, quantification is of course a difficult task in this respect. If one wanted, one could assume that at least part of the price rise was caused by a withdrawal of resources in terms of labor and staples from circulation in Babylonia, resources that went to Susa as requested by the Persian overlords. So in conclusion, the evidence suggests that part of this price rise, which clearly was considered problematic by contemporaries, part of this price rise was owed to inflation and in part to mutually independent supply and demand shocks. The taxation-related argument, which is sort of set out in this slide, can only contribute one reason, and certainly not the only reason for the price development. Nevertheless, I think we can be certain that even if the Persians were not the principal cause of the economic problems of this period, they were probably blamed for them, or in any case, unrest and there's a sense of crisis that must have prevailed in a country which saw a multiplication of commodity prices in the course of a few decades. This feeling of unrest and crisis certainly was also projected upon the foreign rulers. So, second question. How should we describe the Persian reaction to the rebellion? If I simplify to some degree, we find in the sources two, I simplified, of course, use slightly hyperbolic examples, as you will see. We find in the scholarship two conflicting schools of interpretation, two conflicting models. The first model, we might call it the Mongol model, assumed that the Persians, well, made tabula rasa, no? The destruction of temples and so forth. As I say, this is hyperbolic, but to some extent you find this reflected in the literature. And then this sort of conflicting model would be what I call the Habsburg model. So the reaction of the Persians to the rebellions might come down to what I call here a paternal slap on the fingers. The anecdote here of Ferdinand I to Metternich is probably ahistorical, but it does reflect the reactions of the Austrian government to the first weeks of the rebellion of the revolution in 1844 quite well. It should be read out in German with this classical Schönbrunn accent, but I will spare you this. So now, if we have those two models, where do we locate the various interpretations that have been suggested on the scale between those two extreme points? A recent contribution by Heather Baker is important in this respect. In a review article of Peterson's catalogue of tablets excavated in Babylon, she demonstrates that the end of archives pattern that was established and recognized on the basis of unexcavated material also fits the excavated material that was found by Koldewey. That is, archives that predate, that have a sort of substantial part of their tablets in the earlier Achaemenid period tend to end before or around the second year of Xerxes. Now, there's already this was an useful and very important observation. She takes the argument one step further by linking this observation to the archaeological interpretation of the Merkes area that was suggested by Reuter, so by the original excavators. She sees evidence for the destruction of houses and also for a destruction of the Ishtar temple in the Merkes area that is stratigraphically linked to the houses where some of these archives were found. And she connects this destruction level with the year 2 Xerxes, and suggests that the subsequent impoverishment of the area that was observed by the excavators should be explained by a partial abandonment of the area and by the fact that the upper class Babylonians who had lived in this area had been chased away or in one way or another eliminated by the Persians during the reprisals after the rebellions in 484. Now, this argument was taken up in a critical article by Heinz Kuntner and Rollinger in 2011. Their argument in part is historical, in that they argue that the archaeological interpretation was established with the Greek narrative in the back of the excavators' minds, and in part their argument is straightforward and archaeological. They reinterpret the available evidence that they find in the excavation reports, and in part also in unpublished material in Berlin. Their result is that basically there is no such destruction level in Babylon, and that at least there is no such destruction level that can be convincingly linked to the period of Xerxes. There is considerable uncertainty about the construction levels of the Ishtar temple and regarding its eventual destruction. So overall, according to them, Baker's argument, as far as its archaeological part is concerned, cannot stand. This is I cannot evaluate critically this part of the argument because I simply have not looked at the archaeological evidence, and I'm also not qualified to do so. I should just emphasize that also our Innsbruck colleagues emphasize that more work needs to be done on these matters. So if it was not temple destruction and incisive change, what was it? Was it basically a form of administrative change, as, for instance, Rollinger and his colleagues seem to suggest by saying that Xerxes, either before the rebellions or after, had deprived a not insignificant part of the Babylonian elites of their privileges. The Sippar evidence and also the case of Erna in 520 could be seen as evidence in favor of this interpretation. In Sippar, as I said, the Babar archive shows clear traces of having been sifted, of having been analyzed to some extent, and of having been deposited after the removal of the most important files. No one does this who does not want to continue business as usual to some way, in one way or another. So we have to assume that whoever deposited this material assumed that the temple would survive and that business would continue more or less as before. With this in mind, we can go to the Erna temple in Uruk in the year 520. In this year, that is in the second year of Darius, the Erna archive, an archive quite nearly as large as the archive of the Ababa temple, so we're talking about thousands of tablets. This archive was sifted, important material was removed, and the remainder was deposited. However, in contrast to the Sippar archive, which really does end with 484, we do have evidence from Uruk that postdates 520, so we know how matters continued, at least we know to some extent how matters continued in Uruk. We know that several officials were deposed, so high priests and also royal representatives were removed from their offices, and other men were brought in. These people, most of them are actually known from the archive, so they appear in the texts before their accession to office. So there is no fundamental change in personnel. We do know, this is a new insight, we do know that the location of the working archive was changed. So in fact, we know where the old archive was deposited, and we know where most of the tablets that postdate 520 were found, which is another place in the temple complex. So there was sort of also physical change regarding the place of the bureau that managed the archive. Why did this happen? Well, in part, it may have been a result of the political upheavals predating 520. All the officials who were in power under Nebuchadnezzar IV were removed. And there was apparently also a need for administrative change that was felt, especially regarding the case of a troublesome rent farmer who had managed major parts of the temple's business for a long time. That's the famous Gimilu. His file is sort of the final file that is represented in the archive. Apparently, they wrapped up his affairs, and when removing him from office, something which must have happened under with royal consent, or at least, or perhaps even at royal instigation. It is interesting to note that this is another new thing, that this job of rent farmer was eventually taken by the bishop of Erna, so by the chief priest. This is a novelty under the reign of Darius. It has happened never before in Babylonia, as far as I know. However, we have, interestingly, an Egyptian parallel for this, which has been studied by Andrew Monson in a recent contribution. It may be that we have here some kind of royal policy, but I note this also only as an aside. In any case, the evidence of 520 is not very useful for explaining 484, because the interference with extant Babylonian structures that we see in the case of 484 is far more drastic than anything we can observe in 520. Remember that in 520, people got offices who are actually known from earlier years in the archive. This does not happen in 484. Especially the case of the removal of Babylonian families from Uruk, probably also from elsewhere, at least from Ur, there's some evidence, and the closing down of Erna is evidence for interference with Babylonian structures that is extremely far-ranging and incisive. Overall, the end of archives phenomenon and the disappearance of the old elites that is linked to this phenomenon remains an argumentum in silencio, but the evidence for it is very consistent and keeps reappearing wherever one looks. So I would assume that taking 484 merely as a terminus postquem for these changes is to some degree forced and artificial. Now, one body of evidence that has not been discussed very much in the past can be brought to bear on this issue, and this is the evidence of change in the main temple of Babylon in Esangila. Esangila is the nucleus, the core of the Babylonian religious worldview in this period, especially in the worldview that was promulgated by the Neo-Babylonian Empire and that survived into the period of Achaemenid domination. So change in the area of this temple must be considered very important and more must be given more weight than change in provincial cities such as Sippar or even Uruk. Furthermore, I want to remind you that, as I said in one of the earlier lectures, the Temple of Marduk, Esangila, was a major hub for tax collection and hence also a center of crucial economic importance, which adds to its weight for the entire province of Babylonia. So what evidence do we have for Esangila? We know that there is no bishop, no shatamo, so the chief priest of Esangila is absent between 484 and 330. Again, this is an argumentum in silencio. However, it is, I think, still suggestive that the chief priest reappears nearly instantly after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire in the Esangila archive, even though the couple of hundred tablets from this archive that predate the conquest of Babylonia by the Macedonians do not once mention the Shatamo. So one could argue that the Persians did not want this office to be held by a Babylonian priest. We see the same pattern as in Borsippa. The old families disappear. The existence of the old clans that must have dominated or that demonstrably dominated Esangila prior to 484 is largely ignored by what documentation we have from Babylon. And then an important point, there is in the Esangila archive, which is not a small archive, evidence for a complete change in the way priestly service was conceived in the later Achaemenid period. In the earlier Achaemenid period, as in the Neo-Babylonian period, priests and non-priests, both of them temple dependents to some sort, were strictly kept apart in the documentation. There is no way of mixing up those two groups when reading these texts. It is a fundamental rule of temple accounting that priests and non-priests should be kept separate. Separation which is also reflected by the perception of the priests who take great care to maintain the purity of their bloodlines, who marry only among themselves, and so on and so forth. They keep themselves very consciously separate from the rest of society, a fact which is reflected also by the documentation. In the Esangela archive, this distinction is not maintained, and I do not know of any other Babylonian archive that displays this kind of temple archive, I should say, that displays this kind of mixture of priests and non-priests. It is not the case, for instance, in the Uruk texts from the same period or from the later Hellenistic period. It is not the case for what evidence we have from Nippur or from Kish. This seems to be a peculiarity of Esangela, and the fact that this change happens in the most important temple of Babylonia is, I think, significant. It is a fundamental systemic change in the makeup of the temple and of the organization of the cult, so regarding the main raison d'etre of the temple institution. Change which I believe is very unlikely to have occurred from inside. It is something which, on the basis of my understanding of the working of such temple organizations, cannot have occurred without considerable disruption of the cult and concomitantly without considerable and heavy coercion from outside. So the fact that we have this systemic change in the temple is, I think, positive evidence for some kind of outside interference having affected the organization of the temple in its most important aspects. We still do not know when exactly to date this interference, because the best evidence we have for this new organizational scheme in Esangela dates to early in the reign of Artaxerxes II. However, one might venture the hypothesis that the events of 484 were connected. However, strictly speaking, the gap in the documentation is such that we cannot link this phenomenon directly with the reign of Xerxes. So now I come to my conclusions. First point, I have said that already. In part, the rebellions in 484 were probably prompted by economic difficulties. This is a probable argument, so it is an inference from the data. We do know, in part by an argumentum in silentio and in part through positive evidence, that the Persian reaction targeted priests and officials and their clients from northern Babylonia. We do know that in Sippar there was a systematic takeover of the temple establishment by a new administration which must have been pro-Persian. We see this through the fact that the temple archive was deposited in an orderly fashion, and what was necessary for continuing business as usual was removed. And then the final point, we have this evidence for fundamental change in the administration of Esangela, this positive evidence, which is, I think, inconceivable without application of force, a probable argument, and which possibly can be linked with 484, but this is an argumentum in silentio. We don't have evidence that allows us to narrow down the period in which this change must have occurred. Indirect consequences of 484, very briefly. The change in the documentary record possibly has to do with the disappearance of or weakening of important scribal traditions and scriptoria. In part, we have evidence for royal intervention that mostly dates to the reign of Artaxerxes. The new elites that we find in position are mostly not as well entrenched in traditional Babylonian culture as the old elites had been. Their outlook economically is rather rural than urban, and we do not find this strong orientation towards commerce and tax farming and so forth that is in evidence in earlier periods. Landed wealth and what might be called a rentier mentality seem to predominate in the outlook of these people. Viewing the sort of wider viewing these events in a wider perspective from the viewpoint of economic history, it seems fairly clear that these new elites harvest or reap the benefits of the economic expansion and the economic growth that characterized much of the 6th century, but possibly they did not contribute very much to the sustaining of this economic development, especially in as much as this economic development was a city-based phenomenon that was driven by monetization, by commercialization, and by an increasing division of labor in an urban context. The outlook, as I said earlier, of the new elites is rather urban and rural and based on oriented versus landed wealth. We might then argue, but this needs more discussion, that we see a kind of paradigm shift in Babylonian economic history that can be linked to these changes that occur after 484. This sort of hijacking of an economic development by a new class of by a new elite is something which is incidentally paralleled in Iraqi history in the early Islamic period, when the period of flowering of commerce and so forth in the early centuries of Islamic rule gradually came to a stop owing to social change that was to some extent similar to what we see in Babylonia in the 5th century. Final point, after 484, after the removal from positions of influence and power of the traditional elites, especially the priests, we see an acceleration, I believe, of the process of self-isolation of the Babylonian part of the population, or at least of those strata of society that have left us the documentary record in cuneiform. The fact that after a couple of additional centuries, cuneiform writing is restricted to the communities of priests in Uruk or in the north. This fact is an indirect consequence of the social and political changes, I believe, that occurred in the 5th century. Well, and this is the end of my talk, and I thank you for your attention.